Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run.
Hey, lady, you got any money in the bank? You better hurry.
George, let's not stop. Let's go.
A minute there.
Uh-oh.
Please, let's not stop,
I'll
George.
be back in a minute, Mary.
Today, we're going to talk about Silicon Valley Bank. The dust has settled a bit, so we're going to get into it. Good morning, Dee. How are you?
Good. I have talked to several people now about what is going on with Silicon Valley Bank, or what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, and there's a surprising amount of complexity to it. We have a lot to talk about, I think.
Yeah, so I kind of pieced together a timeline and a story of kind of what happened. I want to go through that first so everybody kind of has some context here. I know you've been hearing a lot about this everywhere, so we're doing our best to kind of put together a story type of timeline so that everyone can conceptualize the events and what happened. And then also, Dee and I both consulted with professionals and others in the industry, just kind of getting their opinions of what they thought was going on and how it works. And we have a couple questions at the end that we're going to try to answer from our perspective. People come from an experience-based sector, or basically how we drive product and businesses is through experience. So we want to talk a little bit about that. So also, we pieced this together by looking at many, many different sources, reading lots of articles, watching lots of videos and things like that. But, there might be little bits and pieces missing here and there. So please do your own research. Don't, take our word for every single detail that's in here. Go hunt around and read a lot of this stuff for yourself. So let's talk about what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and how basically it kind of crumbled and then got rebuilt and what's actually going on. So their business, Silicon Valley Bank, we're all very familiar with them here. They've been around forever. I knew people that worked there. I knew people who worked in IT there. I knew people who worked in marketing there. It's just kind of an institution of Silicon Valley. And it was designed to make loans to startup companies. And basically, a lot of the deals required those startups to use their services, such as keeping payroll, using them when gaining investments and putting the money into their bank. So they wanted to be this full service system, which means that a lot of the startups actually did all of their banking with only Silicon Valley Bank, right? You just kind of have all of your assets in there. And you'll start to hear about that in the news, where you'll see a lot of the big startup companies that you're familiar with do billions of dollars worth of financial services with Silicon Valley Bank. So basically what happens is, as a startup raises more money, or they raise rounds, you'll hear about this, right? So they'll go to a VC and they'll say, hey, I have this great idea. And they'll say, great, we'll give you 500K. And the next round is 10 million. The next round is 20 million. As they continue to make those raises and deposits the proceeds into Silicon Valley Bank takes those deposits and lends some of that money out to other borrowers and startups. That's kind of how the bank works. So if I give them, let's say, $10 million, yes, my $10 million is guaranteed if I need it, but they would take some of that money that's actually deposited and they would give it to, let's say, D's startup and lend him that. And then he would pay interest on that money that is lent to him. And when he raises a round, he would put his money into the bank. And that's how the system kind of continued to move along. So as a startup uses up its cash and raises more money, the cycle continues and more money goes in and out of Silicon Valley Bank, or any bank that you're kind of working with for this purpose. But in Q3 of 2022, raising capital became more difficult. But the burn rate for all of these startups was the same. So they were spending the same amount of money, but their ability to raise capital and continue to add money to the balance sheet in order to grow their company and kind of hire more people and that kind of stuff slowed down.
Yeah. And
So
just to clarify, when we're saying raise capital, what we mean is actually fundraising through a round of investment from venture capitalists.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, the deposits on hand at Silicon Valley Bank began to decrease and accelerated quite a bit by the end of the year of 2022 and into February 2023. Now, what does that actually mean? That means that fewer deposits were coming in and more money was being pulled out, being used for payroll, being used for real estate, whatever it is. So Silicon Bank's looking at their balance sheet and they're seeing all this money come out, but not as many deposits going in. And that's a problem because eventually what happens? You run out of money, right? So Silicon Valley Bank took steps to raise cash for those deposit withdrawals. They needed to borrow money from somewhere else in order to handle those withdrawals. And then Silicon Valley Financial Group, which was part of the bank, pursued a capital raise as well. So basically, they saw this as being an issue and they decided, okay, we're going to have to solve this issue by borrowing money. Now, this is not uncommon. If this starts to occur at a bank, they'll reach out to other banks, they'll borrow money, they'll inform the federal government, that kind of stuff. So there's a whole process and procedure for this. Around that time, Moody's notified Silicon Valley Financial Group that it was downgrading them. And typically, when a downgrade happens, they give you somewhere around 24 hours notice before it's publicly made aware. So basically, that means like, hey, D, your bank having some issues. We've decided to downgrade you. As in, if people looked up your bank, they would look at your rating, and your rating would be lower than it was, let's say, the previous year. We just wanted to let you know we're going to publicly announce this in 24 hours. So then on Wednesday, March 8th, Silicon Valley Bank Financial Group publicly announced its capital raise. It basically told everyone, hey, we're trying to raise capital because we need it. This is
Mhm.
what got everyone's attention and kind of spooked everybody, right, D?
Yep. So one of the things that ultimately happened was because their money was tied up in securities, which is a common thing to do. They needed to raise money, and by putting the word out in an environment in which everybody's already kind of spooked about interest rates and unemployment, and even though unemployment was really low, but more layoffs, I guess, than unemployment. Plus the kind of demand shift that happened away from kind of in home to out of home, so that the a lot of tech companies were having troubles. This
Mhm.
is all kind of precipitated by the VCs getting spooked. So then startups couldn't raise money because the VCs held back.
Exactly. And on that same day, Silicon Valley Bank sold approximately $21 billion dollars in what's called long dated government securities. So it resulted in an accounting loss of $1.8 billion. And this really spooked everybody. So what this means is well, actually, D, why don't you explain it? Because I know you were really researching the purchase
Yeah,
of
so these are treasury bonds. So it's common practice for banks when they have, or any company really, when they have large amounts of cash laying around, that they'll get it into some kind of secure investment because you can't just put it somewhere and park it there without there being significant risk of it. So it's very common for them to buy treasury bonds, which then it helps with the government to pay for things, but it also provides them some level of yield, and it's usually a pretty low yield because it's so reliable. But it also meant that they had a huge amount of money, and it's also important for context to know that from between March of 2020 and March of 2021, when the pandemic was in full swing, their deposits doubled from around 62 million to 124 billion. From 62 billion to 124 billion. So they were doing very, very well, and they just managed it very poorly by putting all of their, I think, 120 billion into these treasury bonds out of the 160 that they had or so. They they put relatively small amount into what's called mark to market, which means that those bonds, it's a accounting technique in which you're valuing those bonds at their current market value in case you decided to sell them. And usually that means that they have some kind of hedge against an interest raise, because when the Fed increases interest rates, it lowers the resale value on these treasury bonds. So they were looking at 1.9 billion, which they ultimately realized $1.8 billion loss by selling the 21 billion in these bonds that they had in mark to market, which means they're set up for sale. The rest of those, I think over 100 billion, were not set up mark to market. They were set up for long term holdings. So they were set up so that they would hold them to maturity. Now, what that meant was they couldn't liquidate those. And even if they could transfer them to kind of a mark to market and then sell them, they would lose $15 billion on that sale because of the how those treasury bonds were selling.
Yeah, and those were
Well,
marked
all of
for
that,
3 years, right?
Yeah, so those were all locked up, and they couldn't sell them, at least not easily. So that's why they turned to the capital raise, and that's ultimately what spooked people. So this is a company that had over $100 billion in assets that were locked up in investments that they couldn't access.
Yeah, and right at that time when all of this is occurring, that literally that same day, Moody's announced its downgrade uh,
Yeah.
in the evening of March 8th. So you have them making the announcement that they're raising, then you hear that they had to sell all of these bonds and take this huge loss, right?
Mhm.
Then you get the downgrade from Moody's, and suddenly people start to get a little spooked.
One quick detail also is that the Moody's downgrade was because of the anticipated losses on selling those treasury bonds.
Exactly, right? So it's all kind of wrapped in this same couple day bubble. Based on the timeline that I basically saw as we were researching this, and as I mentioned, like it got people spooked. And when I say people, who is that? Well, the venture capitalists who are basically providing the funding to these startups who have these really long term relationships with Silicon Valley Bank. And I want to basically say something here. Everyone I know who has banked with Silicon Valley Bank has absolutely loved them. So I knew a couple startups that use Silicon Valley Bank. It's very common that you'll be told from your venture funder that, hey, you should use Silicon Valley Bank. They're really great. They will work with you. They sit down, kind of work through all the finances, help you get everything squared away. Right? It's all about getting the business up and humming, and they were really really good at that. Um, but some of these VCs got really concerned and basically started telling their portfolio companies to pull their money out. And no judgment here. Like, I feel like D and I run a business, and at the end of the day, we have to make decisions that are best for the business, right? Even if we have a long term relationship with a bank or something like that, and we had to pull out money, I mean, we would have to sit down and decide what's the best decision to move forward. And that should definitely be left up to the company. And I understand that. But it went a little bit further to the point where this was being mentioned on social media and basically caused panic because it's like, oh, this bank is failing. And it's like, well, yes, they're having trouble, but others are kind of coming in and trying to help figure this problem out and shore it up and that kind of stuff. But that kind of social media panic basically caused a run on the bank. On Thursday, March 9th, a long line of customers, including online, on the phone, everything, of startups basically started withdrawing their money. And they withdrawed $42 billion from the bank. Well, only one day later, on the morning of Friday, March 10th, the California bank regulator shuttered SVB and assigned it to the FDIC as a receiver. So what that means is the FDIC took over the bank because basically the bank was gonna fail because everyone was withdrawing this money. They had to provide this money back, but they didn't have the money actually to give everyone. So basically, on Sunday, March 12th, 2023, Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, Federal Reserve Board Chair Jerome Powell, and FDIC Chairman Martin Gruenberg informed Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, who was also struggling, depositors and other customers that they would have access to all of their money starting March 13th. In addition, they stated no losses associated with the resolution of Silicon Valley Bank will be borne by the taxpayer. So, what does this actually mean? There are two parts to this. What they're basically saying is everyone will be made whole. Does it mean that the very next day you walk in and the $5 million you had is basically in your account? Not necessarily. The FDIC only insures up to $250,000, but they are basically letting everybody know that, like, no matter what, we're going to make everybody whole. So the people who ran Silicon Valley Bank and who lost all the value of their stock and all that kind of stuff, that's gone. But the people who were banking there, the people who put all their money into that bank and were just using them as a typical uh, basically like accounting process for payroll and all that kind of stuff was going to be made whole. And I think that was a right decision to make because ultimately those people didn't do anything other than trying to run their startups. So this is kind of where we're at. Any thoughts on all this stuff, D?
Well, so there's a lot of things. There's a lot of little details here. So one of the interesting things is that number one, um, let me make sure I get the name right real quick. So the House Finance and Services Chair, Patrick McHenry, so a representative in the House of Representatives, said that this is the first Twitter-fueled bank run.
Mm.
So he was assigning quite a bit of the blame to the social media posts and the run on the bank. So the reality is that not a single bank in this world can really survive a run on the bank. They're not designed for that. They're if you take all of the assets of the bank, they have no business to do.
Yep.
And the other part of this was that on March 9th, when the run happened, they withdrew $42 billion. And this is a bank that still had over $90 billion in their unsold treasury portfolio. So they have the money, and I imagine what Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell and all these people are doing is figuring out a way in order to kind of liquidate those uh, treasury bonds in order to return the money to the depositors at the bank. So if they could have weathered this, then they could have been okay, or at least they could have eventually figured it out. But the reality is, part of this is because of the way that people responded and kind of the very human, kind of user experience based like reaction to what was going on to establish a run on the bank. And to some extent, I feel like some of those VCs should kind of know better, but they sometimes don't. And to that point, they're ultimately going to be made whole. So maybe it isn't their responsibility to have kind of this level of attention paid to the overall common good. But the other thing that happened was that, and people have called this out, that the deregulation of the weakening of Dodd-Frank, which required stress testing, could have helped avoid this.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why that happened, why that was the case, is because of, and from talking to people who work in finance, they said that the investments that Silicon Valley Bank made were good, but their risk management when it came to potential interest rates was very poor. So what happens when to treasury bonds when interest rates are raised is that their value decreases in if they have to be sold, if they have to be liquidated. So that caused the value of their mark-to-market bonds to decrease. They had that, was it $1.5 billion loss or whatever that was, the
1.8 billion.
$1.8 billion loss. So that caused that. The other thing was they had way too many assets of those treasury bonds in long-term holdings as opposed to mark-to-market. They did not anticipate that the interest rates were going to go up, which they should have, considering that people were talking about it as early as 2018, 2019, because Trump and Jerome Powell and the people who were managing the economy at the time were keeping interest rates very, very low and engaging in inflationary practices. Then the pandemic hit and they were doing quantitative easing, which also causes inflation. And we felt, and plus, we've lost over a million consumers in the market to COVID itself, which also causes inflation. So they should have anticipated that there would be an interest rate hike. They failed to do so. It wasn't so much risky investments because these are very safe investments, but they didn't hedge against the cost, and they didn't keep enough in liquidity or in mark-to-market accounts. So then they couldn't liquidate easily, and they needed to turn to a capital raise instead. They also had, in 2021, the Federal Reserve reviewed their risk management procedures and found 6 deficiencies. In 2022, they did a follow-up. July of 2022, they did a follow-up, and those deficiencies hadn't been fixed. And that same year, between the two, in April, the person in charge of that resigned, the chief risk officer. So I assume because they realized, okay, there's been some mistakes made. And according to the Fed, they were using flawed models that led their officers to believe that the interest rates would actually raise their revenue as opposed to lower it. So they made a huge mistake in that sense.
Yeah.
But given all of that, all of these mistakes and all of this somewhat mismanagement, or at least poor management, they still would have been okay if there hadn't have been the run on the bank, or at least they would have survived.
When we say they would have survived, it means that they would have partnered right with other banks or with the federal government and figured out a solution to the problem, right? And then kind of got the funding necessary and then continued to move along.
Yeah, from what I understand, and somebody out there might know more than me, but they could have switched some of those long-term treasury bonds from long-term hold to a mark-to-market and then sold some of those in order to liquidate. They were looking for a capital raise because I think they were trying to avoid that, and
Yep.
potentially because it might not have happened fast enough in order for them to be made whole.
Yeah. When you say though that they took on too much risk and that they didn't manage their risk appropriately, do you mean that like they simply looked at the risk, thought that they were going to be okay, and went with that strategy, or it was like reckless risk?
Well, I mean, again, these investments, treasury bonds, are incredibly safe.
Okay.
Right? What they did wrong was they looked at what was going on in the they looked at what had probably happened historically and said we need this amount of liquidity available
Yeah.
because they didn't anticipate that there was going to be interest rate hikes, or they didn't anticipate there was going to be a large scale withdrawals. They didn't anticipate that it was going to be difficult for investors to raise money, which I guess in 2021, when everything is exploding, the stock market's going crazy, and they're and investors are everything is going nuts, right? And back in 2021, everything looked great from an investor standpoint, and we even made the point on this podcast that there was a substantial bubble going on in investment markets, every investment market, and that it was going to come back and bite us. And it did. They didn't anticipate it. They thought, okay, well, this is a bear market; it's going to last forever. And
Hmm.
they probably looked at historically what their bull markets looked or what their this bull market's going to last forever. They probably looked at their historically, like, how do we perform if this turns into a bear market? We need this much liquidity, and they dramatically underestimated. And because of that, they ended up in this tough position.
Yeah.
And all of this, they should have been able to predict if they looked at things more critically. They should have predicted that the massive spike in Silicon Valley earnings and investments and those kinds of things would come back to Earth. This is a well-known phenomenon called regression to the mean, and they should have known that there was going to be an interest rate hike.
Yeah.
So these are all things that if somebody was like really taking a long-term look at things, they should have been able to predict, but they didn't.
Yeah, but I kind of look at the situation and I think, this is, coming from our perspective, right? We study human behavior for a living, and I look at this and the first thing that comes to mind is this is just how human beings tend to respond to things, right? So, and
Mhm.
I'll give you a great example. There's so many different categories, not just financial, not just investments in different areas, where the second somebody starts to see progress in something, they assume as a human, it seems like a behavioral thing. We assume that that progress will continue forever, right?
Mhm.
So I'll give you a great example. Is that like some of the most successful shows on television have been ones that follow the 3 season arc, right? And they have 3 seasons, they have a solid storyline, and that's it. When it's over, right? And then you see ones where people are like, oh, producers and executives are like, well, it's making money, let's keep going and going and going. And you see it kind of
Mhm.
taper off and crash, right? And you see this in so many areas. You see it in gambling a lot. Um, and I just wonder if this is just like a fundamental human flaw, right? We look at the situation, we go, well, things are really good right now. I think they'll just continue forever, even though we have data to indicate that it won't. Like telling someone to take money off the table when things are good seems to be painful for them.
Yeah.
All of us, I'm not even going to say them, all of us, right? It's like you see money on the table and you're like, I want to keep it going. I'm going to let it ride, right? It's almost like a human behavior, uh, not even a flaw, just a recognition of how we think as humans. And this situation seems to be very similar to that, um, including the panic part of like, oh my God,
Yeah.
everything, the sky is falling, pull all your money immediately, right? So I asked you this question. Was this event inevitable based on the data you have that they were warned in 2021 that this was coming and they needed to basically shore things up and maybe update their strategy a bit? Or did the social media posts alone drop the fear into the situation and make it worse and basically make this run happen?
Well, it was absolutely avoidable for sure. It was not inevitable. It could have been. It was almost kind of a perfect storm that made this happen because any one of these dominoes, right? If the VCs don't hold back funding, if the Fed doesn't raise interest rates, if there aren't a bunch of rounds and rounds of layoffs that deplete people's savings in Silicon Valley Bank, if there isn't, if they didn't mismanage their bond portfolio, if they had hedged their bond portfolio against the potential of interest rate hikes, and if they hadn't have had the social media posts urging everybody to get their money out of Silicon Valley Bank, any one of those don't happen, and this whole thing probably was avoidable.
I mean, when you take a 30,000-foot view of the situation, how do you look at it for Silicon Valley? Because a lot of people are probably thinking, well, what does this mean for Silicon Valley? My opinion is, my take on it, is that there's going to be a lot of scrambling for a while. And
Mm-hmm.
then eventually everyone's going to get their money all squared away in new banks, or maybe the new Silicon Valley Bank, or whatever it is. And then eventually everything will smooth out and we'll go right back to kind of where we were when it comes to the process and the way in which things work around here. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think ultimately things will be fine. It'll be tough for a little while. People are going to panic more, which is one of the biggest issues, right? That people overreacting to what's going on is creating more issues. So it is one of the things where if people can take a an understanding of what's going on, if like the money is there, they just couldn't access it.
Yep.
All the depositors will be made whole, and any shortcoming that comes from selling off these the bonds prematurely, or at least before they mature, which is literal definition of prematurely, then somehow they'll make up for it in some way. But that will be a relatively small amount relative to compared to the 90 billion they had in these long term holdings.
Yeah.
They Everything will eventually kind of hash out. The money's still there, didn't get set on fire or anything. And then eventually, I think the pendulum will swing back. People will get be a little bit more interested in home stuff and more tech stuff, and things will stabilize. And I don't know that it will get to those peak pandemic levels for quite some time, if ever.
Yeah.
But everything in general is going to be okay. We're not tipping into like a Great Depression or anything. So that's something I think that we can keep in mind.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it's possible this is a good thing? I was trying to think of the positive of this. Like, more local or regional banks now will look more closely at their accounting and kind of shore up areas of concern.
It's possible. What I hope would happen is that, because ultimately I just don't trust the people who are the leadership of a lot of these companies, because they're human and they make mistakes and they get caught up in things. We had for basically since 2008, we've been in this era called the era of free, that what people are calling the era of free money, which means that the interest rates were so low that banks and organizations could borrow from the Fed pretty easily in order to get to cover anything that they needed.
Yeah.
And now that era's come to an end, and I think Silicon Valley Bank was kind of the first one to get bit by that, because they acted as though there was always going to be money for them, and it wasn't, and it hurt them. What I am worried about when it comes to how these companies are run and their leadership is that they get caught up in the moment, and then they make mistakes because they're blinded by recency bias, and they don't do the due diligence that they need to do. And that's why regulation exists, because it feels as though these mistakes keep happening over and over again, just in different decades.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's like we don't learn from the lessons of the past or something, and just what it is. I feel like we learn the lessons of the past and we deploy little bits of it. We don't
Mm-hmm.
employ all of it, because if you look over the long term, like the financial institutions have gotten stronger, and all the things that President Obama did and his team during that time to have more stress tests and to shore up certain areas and things like that. Like over the long term, we tend to figure things out. But we don't do it immediately. We do like a little bit at a time, and we see mistakes come and go, and then eventually we look back and go, "Wow, we're better off than we were 20 years ago."
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's hard because when it comes to banking, I think people want to feel very safe and secure, and that's part of the brand of a bank, right? Is that like
Mm-hmm.
I put my stuff in there because it's more secure, because I know
Yeah.
that nothing will ever happen to it. That's the job or the role of a bank. And I want to talk about that in a minute, but I do want to talk about this kind of third point that I wrote down, which was that this is a little bit of my conspiracy theory hat, but does this help the crypto investors? So did the VCs kind of feel not so bad about kind of shaking things up and scaring everybody because they have so many companies, that are invested into crypto, and for the, see, I don't know, the last decade or so at this point, right? Um, we've been trying to make this case that, hey, crypto needs to be part of this economy. And as you see a bank fail or have problems or struggle, you say, well, wait a minute, maybe you should have some of your money in Bitcoin or in Ethereum or what have you.
I'm going to throw some water on this, some cold water on this, because this Silicon Valley Bank collapse is nothing almost compared to FTX and what happened there.
Exactly right.
Nobody in the Silicon Valley Bank collapse is going to jail, unlike the FTX. And are pretty much going to be made whole,
Yeah.
unlike the FTX collapse, which I think costs investors several times more than the Enron disaster.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't. I imagine there's some people who will say, "Oh, look, this can happen with banks," and completely ignore what happened with FTX or what could potentially be happening with Binance, considering some of the caginess that we've seen come out of their stress testing. I would not. I would not treat it as that way. I don't think that crypto investments are safer than using a bank or buying treasury bonds or anything of
Well,
that
I'm not
nature.
saying safer. I'm talking about this whole diversification thing of like, well, you should, people should consider having a percentage in a stable coin or a stable asset as like one of these crypto coins. You know what I mean? Whether it be Bitcoin or whether it be Ethereum or one of the others. Does it make the case that there should be an additional financial
Well,
available
if you're saying
as
that you should, if you're asking if people should do that, but it's not for safety or security, then what is the argument? Like, what is the reason if it's not
Well,
safety and security?
well, no, I'm saying for safety and security for diversification purposes. So you're like, well, not all my money is at this particular bank. Some of it's in Bitcoin or something, right? I don't feel that way. Like I feel differently
No,
about it. I don't. I look at it as a very, 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 very speculative asset that we'll find out in 10 or 15 years whether or not this has value,
yeah.
right? But I definitely have heard and seen some things of the last week where it's like, yeah, see, if you would have had some of your money in this, maybe that's a good thing. And it's like, no, not necessarily. I mean, did we just forget FTX happened, what, a month ago? Two
Yeah.
months ago, whatever it is, right? Like,
No, I would say if somebody wants to have some investments in crypto, that perfectly makes sense to me. What I would not treat it as is your primary asset class,
uh-huh.
and I would make sure to diversify within it. I would be very careful around centralized exchanges like FTX was or Binance is. What it basically says is that you should have just diversification of where your assets are, especially if they are in excess of 250,000,
Yeah.
and not put all your eggs in one basket. That said, the backups and the assistance that they're getting from the government and making sure that everybody stays whole, that none of that stuff happens when an exchange goes down, when a crypto exchange goes down. You're just left on your own. So I don't see it as like a solution to this problem because it has the exact same problems within them,
Uh-huh.
and a lot of those problems have less visibility on them because they're not getting the Federal Reserve reviews that the Silicon Valley Bank gets.
Yep.
They are not putting their money in the treasury bonds with mark to market in the way that SVB does. There's a huge question about liquidity that's backing up these stable coins like Tether, and the way in which the government will step in and help place these banks into receivership and make sure the assets get distributed doesn't happen with an exchange. So I would say that they're more risky. There's more opportunity for mismanagement or just straight up crime, like what appears to happen in FTX.
Yeah.
There's less safeguards in place. So I
Yeah.
would not treat that as like a more stable or a safer alternative. I would treat that as a higher risk, but with potential for higher return.
Yeah. I have an issue with one thing that you said there, which I wanted to bring up is that you said, oh, the $250,000 limit. I forgot to mention this earlier. I think that's way too low. Like, to be
Yes.
honest, like, I feel like by doing 250 FDIC is backed, basically up to $250,000 per account, I believe it is. That means that, like, if you have a ton of money that you have borrowed or gotten from either loaned or gotten from a VC or something like that, you have to spread it across like 10 banks or something. Like, seems ridiculous, right? Like, I feel like there needs to be another way to handle that because from a UX perspective, nobody wants to manage tons of accounts from different banks. I mean, from tax reasons, for it's just complicated. And the last thing you want to do is deal with that, right? When you're trying to run a
Yeah.
business, it feels very low. It feels very low for an individual, right? An
Well,
individual
this
has
is
300 and then now they have to have
yeah.
two accounts, right? It's like, I don't know. I feel like it should be somewhere around 750 or something. And then from there, if it's a business, then maybe they could even do something different where it's like in the millions.
Mhm. Well, this is why people don't keep liquidity because they're not insured beyond that, and so they put it into treasury bonds. They put it into index funds and mutual funds and things like that because they're stable, they're low risk, and you should get some return on it on average. But if there was a bit more liquidity, I mean, people are concerned about this because savings account numbers are low. Um,
Yeah.
I think partially that's because people are spending more money, and I think it's also partially because people are taking money out of those, and more people are putting those money into investments. I think that's one of the things that we came away from 2020 and 2021 from is that more people, especially younger people, are turning to platforms like Robinhood
Uh-huh.
and keeping their money in investments rather than just in the bank. And part of that's because FDIC, and part of that is because of people, a new generation of people realizing that investments are ultimately the way in which you raise wealth in this world.
Absolutely, yeah. But the point I was trying to make is that, like, as a company, though, like $250,000 is nothing when it comes to
Yeah.
payroll, right?
No,
Like,
it's
you
it's
need like
absolutely nothing.
millions when it comes to payroll. So, are you basically saying I have to spread all my payroll money across all these different accounts, right?
Hmm.
I do think that this event will kind of spur a conversation around the best way to handle this because when it comes to what the actual customer needs, which is the startup founder, let's say, right, of
Hmm.
having one bank, simple payroll process, taking care of their employees so they can focus on building a business versus, oh, well, now that there's risk, right, I should spread my money across all these banks and have to have different payroll accounts and different banks and stuff. It's not conducive to growth, in my opinion. But
Yeah. Well,
um,
what a lot of larger companies do is they put them into things like treasury bonds. This is one of the things that Apple did when they had their huge cash uh, reserves.
uh-huh.
And a lot of them are held in mark to market, so they can sell them if they need to. But then they actually borrow money, even though they have the money. They borrow money from creditors in order to make their payroll, which is why in 2008, when a lot of the creditors went down and they stopped lending money, that companies, even though they had the money, were in danger of missing their payroll.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
No, it's
that's
a
why they
complicated
became too
system.
big to fail because the economy was dependent on those lending in order for companies to make their payroll, which meant that people were dependent on that for their livelihoods.
Absolutely. And finally, this last question is, how does this event erode the UX or the brand of Silicon Valley Bank that many people really, really love in the Valley and have used for decades? Like, can they come back as Silicon Valley Bank again and kind of rebrand and recover from this, do you think?
Well, as far as the brand, I think it's dead. It's now associated with mismanagement and failure and a high profile collapse. The company is dead. The brand, somebody could try to revive it. I don't think it would be the best idea. I'm not very familiar with the UX of banking there because I didn't bank there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things like, oh, hey, Brian, why don't you get your energy from Enron? They're relaunching. It's not really going to happen. Or, oh, hey, FTX relaunch. Why don't you invest your crypto with them?
It's
It's
hard to,
not.
yeah, it's hard to
Yeah.
recover. I kind of feel slightly differently about this only because I talked to a couple of people who have banked with them and been with them for a really long time. And one of the things they said is that the customer service was absolutely amazing. People would help you solve
Mhm.
your problems. They had great financial tools. Like, it was like the place to go when you were like, oh my God, I'm a startup, I'm stuck. How do I get all this stuff, moving? How do I fix my payroll? How do I fix this? And they really loved what Silicon Valley Bank had to offer. But let's say we take away the brand of it, there's now a vacuum, right? There's someone has to come
There
in
is.
and basically provide the same offering to these startups. And if they do, they're going to basically kind of own this whole category. And so I kind of see this as a huge opportunity for some other bank to come in and
Mhm.
pick them up, even if they rebranded as Silicon Valley Bank, but it was like Silicon Valley Bank, a partner of Chase or something, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I would say that's probably going to happen because these startups need someone to kind of hold their hand and help them get through that process. One of the things a startup founder told me, he said, is one of the most stressful and difficult things to deal with is getting all of your finances and human resources just handled while you're trying to build your company, right? And work on your
Mhm.
product is just get it all smoothed out. So having partners that are referred to you by your VC or other startup founders to say, oh, don't worry about it. Call Brian. He'll take care of you at Silicon Valley Bank. They'll get everything squared away within 48 hours. That kind of stuff. It's like a stress relief for these founders. So
Oh yeah.
there's an
I
opportunity
agree 100%. There's going to be, Goldman Sachs West or
there.
a Chase Silicon Valley or something like that. Some probably multiple of these companies are going to try to step in and fill the void. And it might be distributed across all of those, and they might not be as specialized as Silicon Valley Bank was, and they might not have all of the same like types of services. But people will step in because trust me, if somebody is running a startup and they pulled out, their $5 million in investment money that they have, they're not stuffing it in a mattress. They're finding an institution.
No. Yeah.
I'm sure that everybody at Wilson Sonsini and DLA Piper is on the phone all the time right now with all of these startup founders and fund managers and figuring out the best place to take their money and all the contracts associated with it.
For sure. For sure. I mean, it's a process. We've come a long way in the last 2 to 3 decades of building startups in the Valley. And one of the things I've learned is that it is now a very, very formal process. Like they will get your lawyers will get you your financial people, then connect everything together. And, it's like everything is kind of more streamlined, which is
Yeah.
necessary, especially to spin up an idea quickly. And this just kind of shot a hole in that for a moment. But I think it will recover. I think everything will smooth out, and I hopefully will take the lessons that we learned from this and move on.
So, and one last point is, there have been other banks that have failed in since Silicon Valley Bank
Yeah.
did. I don't know the particulars of those. I imagine that they are somewhat similar as far as the conditions that created them, like
Yep.
poor management of their risk and poor availability of liquidity because of this buy-in that the boom of 2021 um, and the era of free money would last forever. But I don't think this is going to be a systemic thing because what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and their relationships with startups is probably not going to be replicated across other industries and other and just consumer banking in general.
Yeah, and one final thing I'd like to say is that anytime Dee and I talk about something that's financial related, we always want to make a point to tell everybody like we're doing our best to try to tell you a story about what happened and kind of weave it into like how we think about things from a UX or a brand perspective because that's the work that we do. But please do your own research. Don't take any of our financial advice. We don't provide any advice. We're just trying to tell you what's actually happening. So do your own research. It's really important to get in there and really read everything and really understand for yourself what this all means for you, especially if you're a startup founder and you're trying to figure things out. So, anyways, this was fun. I'm glad we had a chance to dig into this. We postponed it a week because we just felt like we wanted the dust to settle a little bit and we wanted to get a better grip around it rather than just jumping in right away and just kind of trying to explain things as everything was unfolding. So thanks everyone again. We really appreciate your support. As I've mentioned before, we're on YouTube. You can listen to our episodes on there. Also, if you like this podcast and found it interesting or informative, it helps us a great deal if you subscribe or leave a review on whatever platform you use. Thank you again, and we will see you all next week.